This is part 1 of the read-along for Unit 3.10, Post-Impressionism 2. Lesson Introduction. Post-Impressionism 2. Post-Impressionist painters used color and visible brushstrokes to convey emotion. Paul Gauguin and Vincent van Gogh painted with the vibrant colors of their predecessors, but both painters believed that the Impressionist style was too restricting. So, we're moving away from trying to represent things as they look, and now we're trying to represent emotion. So if you connect one word with post-impressionism, let that word be emotion. They stuck with the vibrant or bright colors of their predecessors meaning the people who came before them, but both painters, Gauguin and Van Gogh, believed that the Impressionist style was too restricting. So here's a Vincent van Gogh painting, Wheatfield with Crows. And here is Gauguin painting La Orana Maria, so that you can kind of get an idea of the work of these two artists. Be sure and download the student guide PDF whenever you're going through your content on your own. It will help you take notes and follow along. And as you read through the lesson, use that student guide to take notes, and you may also make quick sketches of the images to go with your notes. So let's explore two post-impressionists, Gauguin and Van Gogh, an extraordinary partnership. Seldom before or since has the art world witnessed a summit of creative genius as great as what occurred during 2 short months in the fall of 1888. Dutch painter Vincent van Gogh had come to the French town of Arles earlier that year, soon renting a yellow house that doubled as his studio and the focus of a series of paintings. He hoped to found an artist colony in Arles, and he convinced his friend and fellow post-impressionist Paul Gauguin to join him there in October. So, it's not very often in the times before or in the times since that the art world has had two big creative geniuses come together the way we did in 1888 for 2 months. Vincent van Gogh was Dutch. He was from the Netherlands, and he had come to France in this little town called Arles and rented a little yellow house that was his art studio. And he hoped to start an artist colony there. So he wanted to bring other artists down there to live and make work in this little town in Arles. And so he called up his friend and, well, he probably wrote a letter to his friend and got his friend, Paul Gauguin, who is another post-impressionist, to come down in October. Imagine Leonardo and Michelangelo sharing a studio, or Rembrandt and Vermeer painting side by side. Those scenarios may be tantalizing historical what-ifs, but the collaboration between these two giants of 19th century art was quite real. During the brief period in which they shared the small yellow house in Arles, their output was both prolific and inspired. Sometimes Van Gogh would follow Gauguin's preferred method of painting in the studio from memory. On other occasions, Gauguin would accompany his friend to scenic locales around Arles for the plein air approach to painting. Explore two painters' activity on the next screen to see works that Van Gogh and Gauguin painted on the same day in Arles in the autumn of 1888. So if you imagine Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo working together, or Rembrandt and Vermeer painting side by side, that's sort of what it's like in this post-impressionist world with these two big heavy hitters, Van Gogh and Gauguin. During the brief period they shared the small yellow house, their output was both prolific and inspired. So prolific meaning they made a lot of work, and inspired meaning that it was consequential, meaning that these artworks had an effect. Okay, so they weren't just little sort of studies and sketches of things that weren't meaningful to the artists. Sometimes Van Gogh would follow Gauguin's preferred method of painting in the studio from memory. So they'd be inside and they would just be remembering the way something would look and they would paint it. And sometimes Gauguin would go with Van Gogh and they would go outside and they would pick a beautiful location to do plein air painting, which is when you work outside and you paint what you see. So on the next page, we're going to do this two painters activity. So you can see Van Gogh and Gauguin often made excursions to areas in and around Arles to paint what they saw. On one day in 1888, the two painters set up their easels at the ancient Roman burial site of Les Allescamps in Arles. Each painter created his own interpretation of scenes from the burial ground in these two paintings. So they're in the same place. They're not necessarily looking at the exact same view, but they're in the same place, and so you can kind of get an idea of the way these two painters worked. You can kind of see the differences and the similarities in the way they worked. So this is Van Gogh on the left and Gauguin on the right. A brief, tempestuous union. Collaboration between the two artists soon began to deteriorate, but not, as one might expect, out of egotism or jealousy. Van Gogh, in fact, looked up to the older painter as a mentor, while Gauguin considered himself a rebel immune to the art world's petty squabbles. So they worked together for a little while, but their collaboration, their working together, soon began to deteriorate. It started to not work out as well. But it wasn't because of egotism. So it wasn't because the artist's egos, and it wasn't because someone was jealous of the other one. Actually, Van Gogh looked up to Gauguin as a mentor, and Gauguin considered himself a rebel who didn't get involved in the drama of the art world. They agreed about many areas of art and shared a fascination with color, but their mealtime discussions over aesthetics became, as Van Gogh observed, excessively electric. That both men suffered from clinical depression, seizures, and other undiagnosed mental illnesses only added to the tension in their cramped quarters as winter set in. So they agreed on a lot of things, and they both really loved color, but when they would get together and they would sit down for a meal and they would talk about aesthetics being sort of the philosophy of of how things look. Van Gogh observed, or he said, that these discussions became excessively electric, meaning that they were both getting worked up about their discussions about aesthetics. Both of the men suffered from clinical depression, seizures, and other undiagnosed mental illnesses, so that probably just made it worse and added to the tension in their cramped quarters as winter set in. So remember, they've rented a small yellow house in Arles, and now winter is setting in, meaning it's cold outside, so they can't go outside and paint as often and get away from each other. So they're in this small house and studio together, and they're just basically getting on each other's nerves. Finally, just before Christmas of 1888, Gauguin announced that he was returning to Paris. Van Gogh flew into a frenzy and threatened him with a straight razor. After Gauguin fled, Van Gogh, in a fit of anguish, cut off a part of his own left ear. It was a tragic climax to, though not quite the end of, their artistic alliance. They never saw each other again, but the two artists continued their heartfelt and headstrong debates about art by letter until Van Gogh's death in July of 1890. So, just before Christmas, Gauguin decides he can't do this anymore, and he tells Van Gogh that he's going to leave and go back to Paris. Van Gogh gets very upset about this and gets a straight razor, which is a long razor blade that men used to use to shave their faces. Um, and he threatens Gauguin with the straight razor. Gauguin leaves, and Van Gogh is so upset that he cuts off part of his own left ear with the straight razor. Up here you can see he made a self-portrait with bandaged ear. You can see Van Gogh wearing the um, bandage that he had to wear after he cut off that part of his ear. It was a tragic climax to, though not quite the end of, their artistic alliance. So it was sort of um, the climax being the most exciting part of like a movie or a song. So everything had kind of built up to this one really big dramatic moment being the climax to their relationship, but it wasn't the end of their relationship, their artistic alliance. And even though they never saw each other again, the two artists continued their heartfelt and headstrong debates. So they they would argue with each other through letter writing until Van Gogh died in July of 1890. Paul Gauguin was born in Paris in 1848. When he was 3 years old, his family moved to Peru in South America. His father died on the trip there, and his mother, a woman of Spanish nobility, decided to stay in Peru with the children. 4 years later, the family returned to France. At 17, Gauguin joined the Navy, and after his discharge, became a stockbroker in Paris. So he's born in Paris. When he's 3 years old, his family decides to move across the world to Peru. His father died on the way to Peru, and his mother, a woman of Spanish nobility, meaning like a wealthy aristocratic family connected to the royal family, decided to stay in Peru with the children, and then 4 years later, they decided to go ahead and move back to France. And when he was 17, Gauguin joined the Navy, and after he got out of the Navy, he became a stockbroker back in Paris. So Gauguin spent his free time going to museums, talking about paintings, and buying works by Impressionist artists. He rented a studio and made his own paintings, one of which was exhibited at the Paris Salon of 1876. He went on to exhibit his work in 4 Impressionist shows during the 1880s, even though painting was still a hobby for him. When the European stock market crashed in 1883, Gauguin lost his job. Even though he felt pressure to support his family, he abandoned the idea of taking another regular job. All he wanted to do was paint, even if it meant leaving his wife and children. So he's a stockbroker in Paris, working in the stock market, but he spends his free time going to museums, talking about paintings, and buying paintings that the Impressionists are making. He even rented a little studio and made his own paintings. You can see one here that he made in 1875 of the Seine River, which is the river that runs through Paris. One of his paintings was even exhibited at the Paris Salon in 1876, which is a big fancy art show. He went on to exhibit his work in 4 Impressionist shows during the 1880s, even though painting was still a hobby for him. So he's still working as a stockbroker, making paintings in his spare time, and his paintings are good enough that they're getting into shows, but he's still just working as a stockbroker. Then the European stock market crashed in 1883, and Gauguin lost his job. So even though he felt pressure to support his family, he said, you know what, I can't go get another regular job. I really love painting. That's all I want to do, and that's all I'm going to do, even if I have to leave my wife and my kids.